All right, let's dive into another case, shall we? This time, we're taking a look at a true crime story that really makes you think about trust, about manipulation. We're going to be using Case File True Crime, episode 206, Julio Contra Torres, as our main
Oh,
source.
look, that's a good one.
Yeah, this one takes place back in 1976 in the Mount Hood National Forest. It's a murder case, really chilling. You won't forget this one.
Definitely a reminder that even a simple anniversary camping trip, can turn deadly.
Yeah.
It happens just like that. This case, it really shows how a chance meeting can turn fatal and how
Yeah.
people can be manipulated, and the role of forensics. Key to finding out the truth. Absolutely key.
Okay, so picture this. Julio and Connor Torres, they're young, in love, and they're celebrating their first anniversary by going camping in the Mount Hood National Forest. Seems pretty idyllic, right?
Right.
But hold on, because at North Fork Dam, they bump into this guy, a fisherman named Tom Brown. I don't know about you, but just hearing that name, I'm already getting bad vibes.
Yeah, and you know what? Kendra felt the same way. Right from the start, she had a bad feeling about him. He's described as this avid fisherman, knows the area really well, but something about him was just off. Those gut feelings. Sometimes they're spot on, you know what I mean?
And it wasn't just a vague feeling either. I can't remember specific things about Tom that were just red flags, big red flags.
Absolutely. Like his smile, for one, Kendra described it as sleazy, said it made her uncomfortable.
Yeah.
And then there was this incident where he just casually kills a bird, no reason at all. It's a disturbing thing to do, totally unnecessary. And then he cracks a joke about their dog, Rusty. It was dark humor, the kind that makes your skin crawl.
Ugh, yeah. It's like those small details. They seem insignificant at the time, but looking back, it's like they were clues.
Exactly. They give us a glimpse into who Tom really is, what's hiding beneath the surface. We need to pay attention to those gut feelings, to those little signs that something isn't right.
So let's talk about what happened leading up to Julio's death. This is where things get really dark.
So Julio, he's really into fishing and hasn't had much luck. So when Tom promises to take him to a fish dump, a place where he says there are tons of fish, well, Julio jumps at the chance. He trusts Tom, sees him as this experienced local, and that's how they end up going deeper into the forest, with Tom leading the way.
Sounds like a normal camping trip so far, maybe a bit too trusting on Julio's part, but nothing too out of the ordinary. When does everything go wrong?
Well, they set up camp, things seem normal enough. Tom has some liquor, they talk, and then they decide to take a walk. Tom, he knows the area, takes them to this meadow where he claims to hunt deer. Then the next morning, Tom gets Julio up early and convinces him to go deer hunting, which, by the way, is illegal in Oregon during the summer. Tom gives Julio a rifle, and off they go into the woods. 3 days later, Tom shows up at his lawyer's office with Kendra, claiming Julio died in a hunting accident. Tragic, right?
An accident, huh? That's where I started to get suspicious. Going to a lawyer first instead of the police. Something's not right. Did the detectives notice anything odd about their story?
Well, see, Tom had a bit of a past, some petty theft charges. So he was worried the police wouldn't buy the accident story. And at first, the detectives don't see anything too suspicious. Tom and Kendra's stories match up, even when they're questioned separately. And to make things even more complicated, Tom passes a polygraph test.
Wait, a polygraph? Aren't those things notoriously unreliable?
You're right, polygraph tests, those lie detector tests, they measure things like blood pressure, your pulse, how you're breathing when you're asked questions. The idea is if you lie, those things will change noticeably. But here's the thing, polygraph results, not admissible in court. They're not foolproof. Someone could be nervous, anxious, or really good at manipulating the test, and it could skew the results.
Okay, so even though he passed, it doesn't mean he's telling the truth. So initially, Tom's playing the grieving friend perfectly. But something must have happened to make Candace change her story, right? What made her finally tell the truth?
You hit the nail on the head. The turning point is when Condra goes back to the apartment she shared with Julio. Being back in that familiar place, surrounded by memories, it triggers something in her. She has an emotional breakdown and confesses everything.
Wow, it's like her subconscious finally broke free. So what did Condra say really happened out in those woods?
What she describes is truly horrifying. She didn't see the shooting, but she heard the gunshot. Then Tom comes back alone and shoots Rusty, her dog, right in front of her. And then he says, "Yeah, I know. I shot your husband too." Just like that.
Chilling, absolutely chilling. What happened next? Did Condra try to run?
Condra was terrified, understandably. Tom, cold as ice, ties her wrists and takes her to where Julio's body is. Then he forces her to hike through the wilderness with him for days, threatening her, raping her, manipulating her. He convinces her that the shooting was an accident, a terrible mistake they have to cover up.
It's just awful. How did Condra even survive that, both physically and mentally?
It shows how strong she is and how manipulative Tom was. But here's the thing that's really interesting. Tom started to believe his own lie, this whole accidental shooting story. He even confessed this version to his cellmate, Wendell, later on.
Hold on. He confesses to his cellmate, but sticks to the innocent story with the police. That's twisted. Why would he confess to someone who could turn him in?
It's all about control. Tom needed to control the narrative, how people saw the events, even if it meant believing his own lie. It's like he had to maintain this facade of control, even in prison.
So even though Condra changed her story and told the truth, Tom was still claiming it was an accident. But the police couldn't just ignore her confession, could they?
Of course not. And here's where the forensic evidence becomes crucial. Remember, at first the ruling was accidental death. But when investigators really looked at the evidence, things didn't add up. One key detail. There was no gunpowder residue on Julio's face. That means the shot couldn't have been fired at close range, which blows Tom's story out of the water.
The science doesn't lie. Tom could convince himself and manipulate Condra, but the physical evidence told a different story. So how did they get Tom to admit to the murder?
Well, they didn't. Even with all the evidence stacking up, Tom never confessed to the murder. But his cellmate, Wendell, he becomes a key witness. He tells the police what Tom confessed to him, including specific details that only someone involved would know. This backs up Candra's account and further proves Tom's guilt.
Wow, so he confesses to his cellmate but stays quiet with the police? This case just keeps getting more and more intriguing. I need to hear more about this Wendell and what he revealed.
Yeah, Wendell's testimony was really detailed, really damaging for Tom. He told the police how Tom had bragged about the murder, described how he shot Julio, just like that, no hesitation, and how he'd made Candra help him cover it all up. Wendell even offered to testify against Tom. That's how much what Tom told him affected him.
Wow. That's a big deal. So we've got Candra's testimony, a cellmate willing to speak against him, and then you have this really solid forensic evidence, like Tom's trapped. But let's go back to Candra for a minute. I mean, to go through what she did, it's hard to even imagine.
It really is. Think about it. A 16-year-old girl celebrating her anniversary, totally in love, and suddenly it's a nightmare.
Yeah.
Her husband is murdered, her dog's killed right in front of her, and then days of just horrific abuse. It's amazing she even survived, physically and mentally.
Absolutely. It makes you think about the psychology of it all. How does someone even process something that traumatic?
That's where Stockholm Syndrome comes in.
Mm-hmm.
It's a psychological response, a complex one, where hostages or victims of abuse, they start to develop positive feelings towards their captors. It sounds strange, but it's a way to survive. It's how the mind copes with this overwhelming, terrifying situation.
So you're saying that sometimes victims can actually feel empathy or even affection for the person who's abusing them. That's hard to grasp.
It is. Think of it this way. The victim's whole world has been shattered. Their sense of safety, of security, it's gone. They're completely dependent on this person who's also their abuser. It's the mind trying to make sense of that chaos, you know? Trying to find a tiny bit of control in a situation where they have none.
So in Candra's case, could that explain why she defended Tom at first? Why she went along with the accident story?
Exactly. Remember, she initially held on tight to that story, the accidental shooting. It was easier to believe that than to face the truth, that her husband was murdered, cold-blooded, by someone she'd just met.
And Tom, being the manipulator he is, he probably encouraged that, right? Kept pushing the accident story.
For sure. He isolated Candra, controlled what information she got, and threatened her constantly. If she didn't play along, he'd kill her. Classic abuser tactics, keep the victim under control.
It's just heartbreaking. Kendra trying to convince herself it was an accident, her memory all jumbled. It's just awful.
And that denial, the fragmented memory, that's common with trauma. The mind blocks out the worst parts to protect itself from being overwhelmed. It's not until later, when Candra is back in a familiar place, that those suppressed memories start to come back.
Like her subconscious was slowly putting the pieces together, leading to that breakdown back at her apartment. It shows how trauma can surface in ways you don't expect.
And it shows Candra's strength. She faces the truth, chooses to believe her own memories, and then finds the courage to testify against her captor. That's incredibly strong.
It's amazing how she went from defending Tom to being a key witness and putting him away. It really shows how committed she was to getting justice for Julio.
Right, and that 18-page account she wrote, combined with Wendell's detailed testimony and the forensic evidence, it all pointed to Tom's guilt. They showed him for what he was, a cold-blooded killer, No more pretending he was innocent.
This case is like a puzzle, but every piece you put in just reveals something darker. You have the calculated murder, the manipulation, the cover-up, and then Kandra's incredible courage to fight back. It's just captivating.
And don't forget how important the forensic science was. Without the analysis of the gunshot residue, the bullet's trajectory, all those details, Tom's lies might have worked. Justice might not have been served. It's a great example of how important science is in these cases.
It really makes you realize that you have to look deeper, you know? Examine the details, question everything, especially when you're dealing with someone like Tom with his history of violence and deception.
It reminds us that looks can be deceiving. Even someone who seems charming, helpful, they can have dark secrets. And for Kandra, this random meeting changed everything.
But even after all that trauma, Kandra found a way to heal, to rebuild her life. She even became an advocate for other survivors. That's incredible.
Such a powerful message of hope and resilience. Even in the worst situations, there's always a way to heal, to find your voice, to reclaim your truth. Kandra's story is a perfect example of that.
This deep dive has been quite a journey. We've talked about the depths of human cruelty, the power of forensic science, and the extraordinary bravery of a woman who wouldn't be silenced.
But we're not quite done yet. We still need to talk about the possibility of Tom Brown being released in 2023. What will that mean for Kandra? What does it say about our justice system? We'll get into all that and wrap up our look at this chilling case in part 3.
Welcome back. It's good to have you here. This case, it's been a real roller coaster, right? We've seen how a chance meeting, it can turn deadly in an instant. The psychology behind manipulation and how people survive that, it's incredible. And then you have the forensics, shining a light on the truth. But there's one more thing we got to talk about, one last piece of this whole story, and it's a tough one. The fact that Tom Brown could be released in 2023. What's that going to mean for Kandra, and what does it say about our justice system, you know?
It's a hard pill to swallow, for sure, especially with what he did, the impact it had on Kandra's life. To think that someone who committed those acts could be walking around free, it makes you question things. What are our priorities when it comes to justice?
I'm really curious about your take on this. From a legal perspective, how do they decide who gets parole? Is it all about rehabilitation, or are there other things they consider?
It's complicated, and each state has its own rules. But generally, the parole board looks at a few things. How did the inmate behave in prison? Did they participate in those rehab programs? What was the nature of their crime? And if they're released, do they pose a risk to society? It's about finding a balance, protecting the public, but also acknowledging the possibility of rehabilitation.
And in Tom's case, even though his crimes were brutal, the parole board seems to think he's okay for release. Why do you think they made that decision?
It's hard to know for sure, unless we know exactly how they made their decision. But maybe Tom's behavior in prison was a factor. Maybe he did therapy, took some classes, or maybe they decided he wasn't likely to offend again. They do those psychological evaluations, those risk assessments.
But can you really predict how someone's going to act, especially in this case, where the violence was so deliberate, so planned out?
That's the big question, isn't it? We have tools to help us assess the risk, but they're not perfect. There's always that uncertainty. And when a crime is as awful as this one, people naturally worry about it happening again.
It makes me think about Kandra. We talked about her strength, her resilience, but I can't imagine what it's like for her knowing that the man who turned her life upside down could be out there, free.
I can only imagine the fear, the anxiety she must feel. It's a reminder that for victims, the trauma doesn't just go away with a conviction. The idea that their abuser could be released, it brings up all those feelings again.
It's like the wound reopens, even if they've worked so hard to heal and move on.
Right. It shows how important it is to keep supporting victims, not just right after the crime, but for the long haul, especially when parole decisions are happening.
This whole case, it's a serious wake-up call. Evil can be lurking anywhere, and people aren't always what they seem. We have to be careful, aware.
And it shows how vital forensic science is. Without the physical evidence, the stuff that proved Tom was lying, he might have gotten away with it. Science can be a powerful force for truth and justice.
I agree. And Kandra's story, even though it's hard to hear, it shows how resilient the human spirit is. She wouldn't stay silent, she fought for justice, and she used her pain to help others.
Her courage is amazing. It reminds us that even in the darkest times, there's always hope. You can heal, find your voice, and even find purpose in the face of trauma.
So as we finish up this deep dive, what are some things you want our listeners to think about?
I think this case tells us to trust our instincts, look out for those red flags, and not take things at face value. We should support victims, advocate for what they need, and work towards a system that holds people accountable, but also offers a chance for real change.
It also reminds us how strong people can be. Speaking your truth, it matters, and finding meaning, purpose, even after something terrible, that's possible.
And if anyone wants to learn more about this case, Anne Rule wrote a book, Empty Promises. It's a really good look at all the details. And there's an episode of Forensic Files called Head Games. It's fascinating. You see how the forensic evidence was critical to getting Tom convicted.
This has been a tough conversation, but an important one. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive into the case of Julio and Chandra Torres. We hope it's made you think, question things, and maybe even feel a little bit more in awe of how complex human beings are.